дорогие друзья, участники 17-го Всемирного трансперсонального конгресса, мы открываем наши вечерние сессии, встречи с мастерами духовных традиций. И первым у нас выступит один из самых известных и радикальных мастеров – Эндрю Коэн. И я узнал об Эндрю Коэне много лет назад из опубликованных в журнале «What is Enlightenment», в журнале «Что такое просветление», его знаменитых бесед, которые назывались «Диалоги между гуру и пандитом». И в качестве гуру в этих беседах выступал Эндрю Коэн, в качестве пандита известный Кен Билдер, основатель интегрального подхода. Я тогда много занимался Кеном Билдером и читал все, что связано с интегральным подходом. И духовные практики, интегральная духовность занимали очень большое место в этой работе. И в билдеровской карте интегральных духовных практик имя Эндрю Коэна занимало одно из самых высоких и значимых мест. И потом в России мои друзья, издательство «София», Юра Смирнов и Инна Старых опубликовали две книжки Эндрю, которые каждый из вас получил в дар. Это дар от издательства «София», от Инны Старых, главного редактора, и Юрия Смирнова, владельца «Софии», Конгрессу. И книжки эти с простым названием «Просветление – это тайна» и «Просветленная жизнь». Тонкие книжки с небольшим, в общем-то, количеством предложений на странице. Мы знаем, что на некоторых страницах они почти что полупустые, и там в форме некоторых изречений концентрированные ответы на самые глубокие сущностные вопросы. Я думаю, что мало кто из живущих духовных учителей столь бескомпромиссен, столь прям и столь радикален. Если вы хотите узнать, что такое просветление, каковы пути, ведущие к нему, вы должны внимательно, я хотел сказать слушать, но это не то слово, вы должны внимать Эндрю Коэну. И сразу после Конгресса 28 июня в центре «Открытый мир» состоится семинар Эндрю Коэна по его самому последнему проекту, который называется «Evolutionary Enlightenment». Эволюционное просветление. Просветление как неизбежный этап эволюции человечества. Итак, встречайте Эндрю Коэн.
Good evening. So the question that I wanted to begin the talk with tonight, or what I wanted everybody to consider at the beginning of my talk tonight, is a very simple but important consideration. And the question is, we are all always taking a position in relationship to reality, in relationship to life. Any human being at all times and all places, through all circumstances, no matter who they are, whether they are an enlightened person or they are an unenlightened person, is always taking a position in relationship to time, in relationship to circumstance, and in relationship to reality as a whole. So we are all always taking a position. And so, hopefully, by the end of the talk this evening, everybody will be questioning what position is it that they, as individuals, or all of you, as individuals, what position is it that we are taking? What fundamental position are we taking in relationship to reality as a whole. Often we are taking positions in relationship to reality and to time and to experience that we're not aware of. We are unconsciously taking positions. So a very big part of spiritual awakening is, first of all, discovering the position that we have been taking unconsciously, and then choosing very deliberately to take very specific positions that relate to our deepest insights about the nature of reality, about the nature of life itself. Now tonight I want to give a brief introduction to my philosophy and my spiritual teaching. What I teach is called evolutionary enlightenment. So I am putting the traditional mystical teaching of enlightenment, which means the experience of consciousness beyond ego. Enlightenment means the experience of consciousness beyond ego. I'm putting that experience in an evolutionary or developmental context. So evolutionary enlightenment means the experience of consciousness beyond ego in an evolutionary or developmental context. Now the teaching of evolutionary enlightenment is taking a very strong and deliberate metaphysical and philosophical position. All spiritual teachings, all mystical teachings, all are teaching us or calling us to take a specific position in relationship to our experience. Including, there are some teachings, some mystical teachings, some teachings of enlightenment that claim to be taking no position whatsoever. But even the teachings that claim to be taking no position are still taking a position, because no position is a position. I hope everybody follows that, because it is impossible for any human being, embodied human being, to take no position whatsoever. So we're all always taking a position, and the question is, what position are we taking? Are we aware of the fundamental position or positions that we're taking? And if we adhere to a philosophical orientation to life or a mystical orientation to life, what position is our particular chosen form of mysticism or philosophy taking? What position are we taking in relationship to life? So the position that my teaching is taking, the teaching of evolutionary enlightenment, is taking a very specific philosophical and metaphysical position that is biased towards evolution or becoming. So I am very clear and very honest and very explicit about the fact that this particular teaching, this particular orientation, is biased towards evolution or becoming. And there's a reason for this. I was originally, like many of you and many other people from my generation, I was attracted to the Eastern path. Like many people of my generation, I was brought up in a secular country. I'm an American Jew who grew up in New York City. And the cultural secularism that I was exposed to was a little bit different than the cultural secularism here in Russia. I thought that would be funny, but I guess not. Anyway.
You just don't know how it is in America.
Well, you've heard about it. There, the cultural secularism was freely chosen. Here in Russia, I don't think it was freely chosen. So like many people from my generation, I wasn't attracted to Judaism or as a path, which was my cultural heritage, but I was attracted to Eastern mysticism like so many other people from my own generation. Now, Eastern mysticism, like all forms of mysticism, are basically biased towards transcendence. So once again, Eastern mysticism, like all forms of mysticism, or most forms of mysticism, are biased towards transcendence. And transcendence means to experience that state of consciousness and that perspective where we experience a dimension of ourself, the deepest dimension of ourself, that has never been born and never entered the stream of time. The deepest part of who each and every one of us is, the deepest part of who each and every one of us is, has never been born and never entered the stream of time. In the East, they call this deepest dimension of being the self with a capital S. So the self with a capital S is that deepest part of each and every one of us that has never been born and never entered the stream of time. Before the universe was born, before time and space emerged from nothingness, before there was anything at all, there was only that. There was only that deep, timeless, formless domain where there was no time and there was no space. When the universe was born, when the Big Bang happened, all of manifestation in one big explosion emerged from no thingness or emptiness or timelessness. So out of timelessness and out of formlessness, out of emptiness, out of the empty ground of all being, the entire manifest creative process emerged. The time and space emerged as a developmental evolutionary process that had a direction. So the self, the deepest part of who each and every one of us is, the self with a capital S, that is that part of each and every one of us that has never been born and never entered the stream of time. When one enters into a very deep state of meditation, when you enter into a very deep state of meditation, when you experience consciousness beyond the mind, beyond time, beyond form, you awaken to or become aware of the deepest part of yourself where there is no time. The deepest part of who each and every one of us is a place or a no place or a space or a no space. It's a dimension where there is no time. There is no space. There is no world and there is no universe. So the reason that meditation was practiced and the reason that meditation is still practiced today, is to have the experience of awakening directly to that deepest part of the self that has never been born and has never entered the stream of time, and where the telephones don't ring. The reason why we experience spiritual freedom when we awaken to the deepest part of ourself that's never been born and never entered the stream of time is because before the universe was born, before there was time and before there was space, we did not have any problems. Before the universe was born, before there was time and space, we had no problems to overcome. It was only after the Big Bang, after the creative process was initiated, that we found that we had problems that we wanted to overcome and escape from. Right? So the reason that we experience freedom, primordial freedom, when we enter into deep states of meditation, is because in that mysterious no place, it's a place where nothing ever happened, where we have never been born. We have not accumulated any karma yet. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened yet. So before anything ever happened, everything was perfect. Before anything ever happened, everything was always perfect. This is why when we enter into very deep states of meditative concentration, we directly experience that primordial freedom that is the immediate experience of that mysterious place or mysterious dimension where there's no time and there's no space. Now this timeless, formless ground of all being, for 5,000 years, has been the mystical destination, has been the destination for all forms of mysticism, or most forms of mysticism all over the world, in the East and in the West. So the mystical awakening in the East and the West has been the revelation, the insight into the direct experience of, the direct knowledge of that deepest dimension of reality where there's no time and where there's no space and where nothing ever happened. The individual who has access to that deepest dimension of the self experiences a primordial freedom. It is a freedom from knowing that nothing ever happened, that you've never been born, and that you've never entered the stream of time, and that everything is always okay. Because in fact, from the perspective of the part of yourself that's never been born and never entered the stream of time, nothing's happened, and everything is always perfect. This is what my teacher taught me. My own spiritual teacher, my own guru, taught me this perspective, and it had a very big effect on me. But after I became a teacher over 25 years ago, I discovered that what my teacher was teaching me was the traditional metaphysical position of enlightenment. I realized that he was only teaching me half of the picture. Because the totality of reality is made up of timeless, formless being, and also the evolutionary process, which had a beginning in time. The evolutionary process has been in progress for about 14 billion years, a little less than 14 billion years. So out of this primordial empty no-thingness, out of this empty voidness, there was the dramatic emergence of time and space and form. And so what I began to understand, that time and space and form is as much a part of the totality of reality as is timeless, formless, emptiness, and nothingness. I started understanding that the most complete and total understanding of what reality is both timeless, formless being and evolutionary becoming. That's the full and complete picture. There is nothing that exists outside of timeless, formless being and evolutionary becoming. And a simple way to understand this is just to draw a circle. We just make a circle. This is just a very simple model. It's just to draw a round circle and then draw a line through the circle. And we say the bottom half of the circle is timeless, formless, empty being, the abode of the self with a capital S. And the top half of the circle is the entire realm of manifestation that had a beginning. Time began 14 billion years ago, a little less than 14 billion years ago. And everything that exists in the top of the circle is everything that's happened and is happening within the realm of manifestation. And if we put those two together, we have the totality of reality. Everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist. It's the totality of everything, seen and unseen, known and unknown, exists within this circle. Nothing exists outside it. The perennial mystical revelation, the perennial mystical insight is that there's only one and not two. So all mystics throughout the ages report to us that what they have discovered is that there's only one and not two. So whether that discovery happened 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, or yesterday, all mystics tell us more or less the same thing. That the ultimate truth is there's only one and that there's not two. And they tell us the discovery of the fact that there's only one and not two is absolutely liberating. And the reason for that is because in our unawareness of oneness and not two-ness, we see ourselves as being separate. We see a world of multiplicity and differentiation, and we see ourselves as separate from that process. So when we discover that there's only one and not two, it becomes apparent to us that who we always are is that one who cannot be two, and who everyone else is that one who can't be two, in every aspect of the creative process, every aspect of it, from our capacity for interiority, for consciousness, and for cognition, for thought, including all the materials that went into building this building, are all part of this process that's only one and not two. The truth is that there's only one and not two. So when we go back to this circle, which says the bottom half of the circle is timeless, formless, empty being. The top half of the circle is the world of evolution, the world of manifestation, the entire world of the creative process. We say, well, timeless, formless being and time-generated evolution are all part of the truth that there's only one and not two. The entire circle is one and not two. The ultimate metaphysical realization is that there's only one and not two. Both being and becoming are one and not two. Both being and becoming are both one and not two. So this is a very important foundational philosophical metaphysics. It's very important to understand that both being and becoming are one and not two. Now that being said, that the world of form and the world of formlessness, that the world of time and the world of timelessness are only one and not two, now that we understand that, it's also important to understand that most forms of mysticism have a subtle or not so subtle philosophical and metaphysical bias either towards being or becoming. It means there's a bias, there's a preference. In Eastern mysticism in general, in Eastern mysticism, there is a bias towards being, timeless, formless being. When I say a bias towards timeless, formless beings, it means there is a subtle or not so subtle preference for timeless, formless being. In Buddhism, in Vedanta, in yoga, the destiny is to achieve a state of consciousness beyond time and beyond the world. What I'm teaching here, when I'm putting the teaching of enlightenment in evolutionary context, what I'm teaching here is very much biased towards becoming. The teaching of evolutionary enlightenment says both being and becoming are one and not two, but we're choosing to give a greater significance to becoming, to evolutionary becoming, knowing that evolutionary becoming is a seamless part of being. And I want to explain why there's a subtle metaphysical bias. But I also, before I explain that, I think it's important to understand that I discovered about 8 or 9 years ago something very interesting, and that it's impossible for there not to be a subtle bias towards either being or becoming, a subtle preference towards being or becoming. So what I'm going to be speaking to you about now I want to speak about the evolutionary worldview and evolutionary spirituality, is very deliberately biased towards evolutionary becoming. But I want to reemphasize that both being and becoming are part of a singularity. Being and becoming are part of a singularity. Being and becoming are one and not two. When the universe was born, when 14 billion years ago, when something came from nothing in the Big Bang, the time process began. The time process began. But remember, the time process and the entire world of manifestation that created us and is making it possible for us to have this conversation all emerged from empty no-thingness. So the source of our existence, the source of the desire to exist in time comes from timelessness. Time comes from timelessness. Becoming comes from being. So one way to understand this metaphysical position is to put it in a theological context, which some people don't like and some people like. Now, I was born into a secular family, so we didn't really believe in God. We were secular Jews, so we didn't believe in God. So for me, to speak about a great, the absolute, this great singularity, and to use theological language is a relatively new experience for me, but it's fun. Especially if one has gone through this process of secularization, and we don't really believe that there's anything that transcends. There's no ultimate transcendent, non-relative or absolute dimension. When we discover that there's an absolute or non-relative dimension to life, it's kind of a big discovery. It's like if you were convinced that there was no such thing as a higher, non-relative, absolute dimension, and then you discovered that there was, it's quite a shock. It's a big shock. Because our education tells us that the world that we live in, basically a material world, that is meaningless, purposeless, and ultimately directionless. And when you find out that there is a non-relative, absolute ground for all of existence, and that actually time and evolution has a direction, that we're all part of a process that's going somewhere, it's very exciting. Especially for people that come from a secular background like myself, and I'm sure many of you here in Russia. When you discover that you're part of a process that's going somewhere, and that the nature of the process, when it is experienced as a spiritual revelation, not just as a philosophical perspective, but when you actually experience for yourself the non-relative or absolute nature of the process as a whole, it's a metaphysical discovery. You discover, you awaken to, you become aware of the fact that both being and becoming are singular. That singularity is not a relative singularity, it's an absolute singularity. And when we become aware of the non-relative or absolute nature of the entire process, this is when we have access to the enlightened awareness. We become aware of infinite depth, and we also become aware of infinity. That infinity means there's no beginning and no end. No beginningness and no endness. So the nature of becoming, the nature of the Big Bang, the nature of evolution, when you grasp it as a metaphysical revelation, not just as a philosophical insight, but as a metaphysical revelation, you realize that the desire to exist, that the entire evolutionary creative process, we can recognize to be the impulse or the desire to exist in form that emerged from formlessness. When you enter into a very deep state of meditation, if you're a good meditator, and I assume some of you are good meditators, what you experience is the absence of desire. desirelessness. The Buddha taught us that the problem of suffering, the problem that causes human beings to suffer, is desire. And he taught people that if you enter into a very deep state of meditation, you experience freedom from desire. You want nothing because you're experiencing timeless, formless being where there's no desire. But I discovered something that's interesting, is that when the universe was created, when something came from nothing, when the Big Bang happened, that the Big Bang we can understand through our very own human experience as the desire to exist in form. That formless, timeless being, which is our true nature, timeless, formless being in our true nature, seems to have had an aspiration or a desire, a cosmic desire, a godlike cosmic desire to exist in form. This is what you call an anthropomorphic interpretation of the Big Bang. And I'm doing this intentionally. This is an anthropomorphic interpretation of the Big Bang. We're looking to understand the Big Bang as a human-like experience. There's other ways to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it, but it's a helpful and interesting way to look at it. So the deepest part of who we are is timeless, formless being. The entire realm of manifestation and the entire creative process emerged from timeless, formless being. And we can interpret the evolutionary process, the Big Bang and its momentum, and its 14 billion year momentum, as a desire to exist in form. Now, the reason why I speak about the desire to exist in form with such confidence, I say, how do you know that this is true? And I say, because I've looked into this in my own experience. I said, I wanted to know, what does the absolute, we can use the word God, I think at a transpersonal conference. See, in any other country that would have made people laugh. But anyway. Okay, but I wanted to know what was the experience of God in form and in formlessness. So it means, what does the absolute, what does the metaphysical absolute, what's the metaphysical absolute, the non-relative absolute, which is what God from a metaphysical interpretation, what God is this non-relative perception, the actual direct perception, the direct cognition of that which is not relative, of that which is absolute. So that's what God means. And I wanted to know, what was that experience from the perspective of timeless being and also from the perspective of becoming. So what God feels like, what it feels like to be God, or the non-relative metaphysical absolute, from the perspective of timeless, formless being, is being absolutely free from desire. No desire. Infinite peace. Nothingness is infinite peace. It's wanting nothing and experiencing infinite peace and infinite fullness. Right? If you look at a Buddha statue, if you look at the statue of the smiling Buddha sitting in meditation, the traditional posture of the seated Buddha, why is he smiling? He always has a little smile. Why is he smiling? He's smiling because he doesn't want anything. He's absolutely free from desire, and he's experiencing the infinite peace, because when you want nothing, you experience freedom. When you want nothing, you experience freedom. So he was speaking about the desirelessness, which is the nature, which is the absolute nature of timeless, formless being. But when the non-relative absolute changed its form and took the leap, when the non-relative absolute changed its form and took the leap from timeless being to infinite becoming, when the absolute changed shape and took a leap from timeless, formless being to infinite becoming, the nature of that absolute, the nature of the non-relative absolute changed. Its quality changed. It changed absolutely. The absolute quality of the absolute changed absolutely. It's a paradox, and it's a complete contradiction, but it's also one and not two. And the shift was, what is the nature of the non-relative absolute when it enters into the realm of manifestation, when it takes the leap from timelessness to time? Well, it becomes ecstasy and urgency. Ecstatic urgency is the nature of becoming and the desire to exist in time. The desire to exist in time, the urge to become, the desire to exist, which is the nature of life, the nature of the life impulse, the urge to exist, the urge towards existence, and which is ultimately the urge towards consciousness itself, is what I call the evolutionary impulse. The evolutionary impulse. The evolutionary impulse is the desire to exist. The desire to exist. If you ever observe life, life is very tenacious. Have you noticed? Have you ever observed nature? Have you ever observed nature? The oceans, the forests, wildlife. There is a tenacious, voracious desire to exist, to multiply, to be here, Look at human nature. In spite of all the conflict that human beings have suffered, despite all the conflict, and despite all the challenges that we have faced from Mother Nature, human beings have become, the dominant life form on the planet Earth, which means to say, human beings used to exist within nature. Human beings existed within nature, but now at the beginning of the 21st century we realize the picture has shifted. Now nature exists within us. Nature now exists within us because we are the most dominant life form on the planet, and are the choices we make and the actions we take are going to determine ultimately where we're going to determine the future of nature, are the choices that human beings make. So we are now the dominant life form on the planet. So as up until very recently, we existed within nature and within Gaia. Now I think it's fair to say that Gaia exists within us, which of course gives us an enormous amount of responsibility, but that's part of another discussion. So I want to speak a little bit about the absolute or non-relative nature of the evolutionary impulse, which we can understand to be the desire to exist, which is the nature of life. Life seems to, if you observe life in nature and also in human nature, you can see that there is a very powerful, voracious desire to exist. Apparently, we very much want to exist. I'm talking about the nature of the evolutionary impulse, the nature of the life impulse. Evolutionary impulse is the life impulse, and the nature of the impulse we can interpret and understand as a desire to exist, the will to exist, the will to exist, the will to exist. We can see the entire creative process, which began with the Big Bang, as the manifest expression of a desire to exist or will to exist. And you say, well, how do you know? How do I know this? I say, well, all we have to do to find this out is to locate within our own human experience, to locate the pulsation, the vibration, and the pulsation of the evolutionary impulse within our own experience. And when you locate the vibration and the pulsation and the manifestation of the evolutionary impulse within your very own human experience and observe what its nature is, you begin to recognize exactly what I'm speaking about. So the place to start is to look at the sexual impulse. The sexual impulse is the biological command to procreate. The biological command to procreate. So what does the sexual impulse, as the biological command to procreate, what does the sexual impulse feel like? Because the sexual impulse is an evolutionary impulse. It's the lowest, most primordial expression of the evolutionary impulse. It's one we share with many different life forms. So what's the nature of the evolutionary impulse as it manifests itself through the sexual impulse? What is its nature? So its nature is ecstasy, and urgency. The sexual impulse is ecstasy and urgency, right? Both ecstasy and urgency. And we all know, being human beings, why the sexual impulse can become problematic or can create problems. It does create problems for many people. It's not because of the ecstasy part of the impulse, but the urgency, right? Usually people find that a little bit funny, but I don't know what to do, but that's okay. It's a cultural thing. First time to Russia, so I've been all over the world, but I've never been to Russia, so I have to learn about. Though the translation, it's late. Okay, so now you should laugh then. It's okay. Thank you. So the nature of the evolutionary impulse, when it's expressed or manifest as the sexual impulse, as the biological urge to procreate, its nature is ecstasy and urgency. So the human experience of what does the evolutionary impulse feel like? It feels like ecstasy and urgency. But we've talked about really its lowest expression. Now, human beings are the only sentient life forms. Human beings are the only sentient life forms that experience there's a drive towards innovation. A creative drive towards innovation. Dogs experience the evolutionary impulse as the sexual impulse, and cats and cows and horses and birds. But they don't experience the evolutionary impulse as the urge and the desire to innovate and create that which is new. So this is very interesting. If you think about the most creative human beings that you know, whether they may be scientists or artists, philosophers, musicians, politicians, the architects of human civilization, the greatest architects of human civilization throughout history, those men and women that have had the greatest influence on our development, have been individuals who are driven by the urge to innovate and the desire to give rise to that which is new. Millions of years ago, when human beings were very primitive, this innovative drive was operating very slowly. we might have done the same things the same way for 500,000 years. And then maybe because of some natural disaster or calamity, we would come up with a different way to do things. But this urge to innovate, this drive to give rise to that which is new, the drive towards innovation, especially with the Western Enlightenment, the 1700s, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 20th century, and now in the 20th century, has sped up. So the human capacity to innovate, the drive to give rise to that which is new, has reached exponential proportions. In other words, it's going faster and faster and faster, right? So the urge or the command to innovate, the uniquely human drive to give rise to that which is new towards innovation, has reached exponential proportions. We are evolving and developing in many ways so much faster than we ever have. And there's a drive. We are being driven. We're driving ourselves. And as I said before, if you ever meet a very gifted person, not an ordinary person, but a gifted person, a very gifted or talented or inspired musician, or a very gifted or inspired scientist, or a very gifted or inspired artist or poet or philosopher or politician. These are people who are driven to give rise to that which is new, whether it be in art or science or philosophy or political freedom or whatever it is. There are some people that are driven. They're so driven that you say, maybe you should take a rest. Maybe you should take a vacation. Maybe you should sleep in a little bit. And they say, you don't understand. I can't stop. I have to do this. Because something is happening. Something is trying to happen. Something's coming through me. Maybe I'll win the Nobel Prize. So the nature of the evolutionary impulse is the urge to innovate and the urge to give rise to that which is new. What does it feel like? What does an artist or a scientist or a philosopher or a poet or a public servant feel like when they're driven to give rise to that which is new? They experience ecstasy and urgency. Urgency, it's very urgent. The evolutionary impulse is the experience of urgency. Urgency. Remember, being and becoming are one and not two. Being and becoming are one and not two. But the experience of being is peace and desirelessness. The experience of becoming, as the evolutionary impulse, is ecstatic urgency. Ecstatic urgency. So the lowest form of the evolutionary impulse is the sexual impulse. The next level that it becomes very clear is the urge to innovate, the urge to give rise to that which is new. And the highest and the most profound expression of the evolutionary impulse in human beings is the urge towards consciousness, the urge to become more conscious. It's the spiritual impulse. The spiritual impulse is an evolutionary impulse. The spiritual impulse is an evolutionary impulse. What does the spiritual impulse feel like? I must become more conscious. I must become more conscious. It's the urgency. I have to become more conscious. The spiritual impulse is the experience of a desire, of an impulse, of a command, of a moral obligation ultimately towards consciousness. I must become more conscious. And some people experience the evolutionary impulse as the spiritual impulse with great intensity. Most individuals who have ultimately become spiritual luminaries, spiritual masters, are individuals who are driven by the ecstatic urgency of the evolutionary impulse, experiences the spiritual impulse, which is the urge towards consciousness. The urge towards consciousness is felt as I must become more conscious. I have to become more conscious. I don't have a choice. It's ecstatic urgency, urgency, urgency. So the non-relative absolute is the ultimate nature of all things. There's only one and there's not two. The ultimate metaphysical insight, revelation and realization is there's only one and not two. There's only one and not two. But that one is experienced as both timeless, formless being, where there's desirelessness and only peace. And it's also experienced as the evolutionary impulse, which is the experience of ecstatic urgency, which is the desire to exist. And it's more than the desire to exist. Because within the evolutionary impulse, when we observe it, when we scrutinize it, when we look very deeply, so what's the nature of the evolutionary impulse? It's the desire to become. It's the desire to develop. It's the desire to develop, to become more. I want to develop. I want to become more. We can see this drive in biological evolution. If you look at the evolution of life, there's a drive towards greater complexity. There seems to be a movement or a trajectory or a direction which goes from lesser complexity to greater complexity. From lesser complexity to greater complexity. We can see this in biological life, because life started, at a level of very simple bacteria, which eventually gave rise to multicellular creatures and to more complex life forms, etc. If we look at the evolution of biological life, there's a movement from simplicity to complexity, but also when we look at the interior of the life process, the interior of the life process. This is the exterior. The exterior is form. This is form. The exterior, so the interior is consciousness. The interior is consciousness. So your exterior is your physical form. Our exterior is the physical form. Interior is consciousness. Our interiors are consciousness. And as biological life is part of a process of greater and greater complexification, the interior of the process is also part of a process of greater and greater complexification. So our interiors are striving towards, interestingly enough, reaching towards greater complexity. Where does human curiosity come from? Why do you want to learn? Why do you want to know more? Why do you want to understand? Have you noticed that people who are very curious and who want to know and want to understand are more alive than people who don't want to grow and than people who think they already know? Have you noticed that people who experience and manifest great curiosity are much more alive, deeply alive, profoundly alive, than individuals who are not curious? So people who are curious, who want to know and want to understand, are awake to the life impulse. They're in touch with it with much greater intensity. And a very interesting part of all this is when we begin to appreciate the fact that it's not our curiosity, that our experience of curiosity, that our desire to evolve, that our desire to become more conscious, that our desire to see more, to know more, to understand more, it's not a personal desire. It's not merely a desire of the individual, but it's really the interior of the cosmos, the interior of the universe, the interior of the cosmos is trying to evolve through us. And I find that particular way of understanding this very enlightening, very illuminating, when you begin to see that your own felt aspiration to grow, your own aspiration to become more conscious, to understand, to become enlightened, is not a personal desire, but it's a cosmic aspiration. And you begin to see and understand that the entire cosmos, the entire creative process, the entire universe is trying to evolve through you. The universe is trying to evolve through you. When you experience the urge to innovate and to create that which is new, when you experience the spiritual impulse and the urge to become more conscious, the energy and intelligence that initiated the creative process and is driving the creative process is trying to evolve through you. So that means the evolutionary impulse, the urge towards consciousness, the urge towards innovation, the desire for growth, the desire for greater interiority, is the aspiration is a cosmic aspiration that you're experiencing. And then you experience that oneness, that one that's not two, that one that's not two that created the universe, is trying to become more conscious through your very own existence here on Earth. And personally, I find this extremely amazing. If you really think about the fact that it's not the individual that's striving to become more conscious. It's not the individual who's striving towards consciousness. We realize that the energy and intelligence that caused the Big Bang to happen is trying to evolve and become more conscious through you. If we would choose to call the non-relative absolute or God the energy and intelligence that initiated the creative process and is driving the creative process, then it becomes apparent to us that what we're calling God, the non-metaphysical absolute or God, is only as evolved or as conscious as we are. That there's no metaphysical, there's no Godhead that exists out there beyond the world, up in space. There's no God that exists as other than the process. What we're calling a non-metaphysical absolute is the energy and intelligence that's driving the creative impetus in the process itself. In your own experience of the sexual impulse of the urge towards innovation and the spiritual impulse, which is the urge towards consciousness, is the manifest expression of that singularity. So as I was saying, what's so fascinating about this is that when you realize this, you begin to understand that the universe is trying to evolve through you, that we are just vehicles for consciousness. That your body, your mind, your personality is a vehicle in which and through which this process is aspiring to occur. Now, when human beings reach higher levels of individual and cultural development, they begin to realize this. Because at lower levels of individual and cultural development, we can say that human existence was, and for many people still is, primarily about survival, day-to-day survival, and about biological procreation. So we can say human existence, for the majority of human history, for most people, has more or less only been about procreation and survival. But as we have gained access to a higher standard of living, wealth, education, it's made it possible for us to we no longer have to use up all of our energy merely to survive. And as we've been given as the great revolution that modernism was, modernism gave us time. It's given us time and freedom to think, to read, to consider, to question, who am I? Who am I and why am I here? These are the two fundamental spiritual questions, the perennial spiritual questions, is who am I? And why am I here? Who am I and why am I here? Now, most of the great metaphysical traditions answer the first question. They tell you who you are. All the metaphysical traditions tell you who you are, but they don't tell you why you're here. But when we discover an evolutionary worldview, we actually discover the answer to the second question. We discover the answer to both questions. We discover who we are. We also discover why we're here. And the answer of why we're here is very important in the modern and in the postmodern world. Now, I'm not so sure where the general level of culture in Russia, because I don't know Russia very well, but my feeling is in general, the postmodern stage is very new here, and it's probably a very small minority of the Russian population has reached the postmodern stage. And probably the majority is at the modern stage. Russia is just entering into, the leading edge is entering into post-modernity. But the question is, and the reason why this is important is with modernity, with modernity there was a big shift. Because when they were in the traditional world, before modernism, we lived in a traditional world. And we saw the world through the traditional religious worldview. God was up there. God lived as external to the world, beyond the world. We were here. And we embraced a very superstitious worldview that was based upon the great religions and the myths that are the foundation of the great religions. All the great religions, especially the Western ones, are based upon creation myths, stories about creation myths. But the birth of modernism really freed the human mind and the human spirit to be able to develop. It made it possible for us to develop, to question everything, to be able to use our rational mind, to see through a lot of mythical and superstitious beliefs that weren't true. And there was an enormous revolution that we've all benefited enormously from. Even the utopian aspiration gone wrong, that was socialism and communism, modernism made that possible. But the problem with modernism is that we lost touch with spirit. We lost touch with the absolute. With modernism, we gained many freedoms that we never had before, and the standard of living has gone up for billions of people all over the world, and still is. But modernism only embraced materialism. The material nature of reality is real, and really rejected the more subtler dimensions of our interiors. They said they're only exteriors, they're only surfaces, and the interiors aren't very real. And what's happened is we find in modernism and in postmodernism, that the self, which is now enjoying the fruits of modernism, which is a high standard of living, and the fruits of modernism, and the fruits of postmodernism, which is political freedom, women's liberation, the freedom to be an individual, the freedom to think and to do as we please, that in spite of these great freedoms, that the self, the modern self, and especially the postmodern self, finds itself experiencing deep alienation. Doesn't know, why am I here? Why do I exist? And this really, I feel, is the existential, spiritual, moral, and philosophical predicament of the modern and postmodern self. Because the postmodern self has a higher standard of living than human beings have ever had, and experiences political and personal freedoms that are unprecedented historically. But the problem is that we don't really know why we're here. And many people from my own generation and from our children's generation, Gen X, Gen Y, the baby boomers, Gen X and Gen Y, suffer from a deep spiritual and existential and philosophical confusion as to why of existence. Why do I exist? If we don't know why we exist, if we're not clear about the fact of why we exist, if we don't know why we're here, it's very difficult to be very committed in our life. What are, you know, if you know why you're here, if you have a purpose, if your life has an absolute purpose, it changes everything. It doesn't change a little thing, it changes everything. So I feel that the spiritual project, really for the modern, and especially the postmodern self, is the discovery of absolute meaning and absolute purpose. And I believe that spiritual liberation, spiritual enlightenment, and spiritual liberation for the modern and postmodern self is found, I think, only through the discovery of an absolute sense of purpose and purposefulness, meaning and meaningfulness, discovering an absolute sense of purpose, direction, meaning. Not only do I know who I am, but I know without any doubt why I'm here. I know why I'm here. So when we embrace a evolutionary spirituality, a spirituality that emphasizes the becoming part of God, the becoming half of the circle, if we really look deeply into the nature of becoming, which I'm going to do with you now, we discover in our own immediate experience, an absolute desire to exist. And we discover an absolute sense of purpose. And it changes absolutely everything. Everything changes. We become completely different people. We become completely different people because the modern and postmodern ambivalence, the existential ambivalence, the philosophical confusion about whether life is good, about whether life is worth living, is gone. Because what we discover is that the desire to exist is absolutely good, that the nature of the desire to exist, the nature of existence itself, is absolutely good, is unconditionally positive. And that we also find, and I'll explain why, that our existence, that your existence, that our existence as the individuals that we already are right now, has inherent meaning. So when the Big Bang happened, when something came from nothing, was this a big yes? Was it a big no? Or was it a big neutral? When something came from nothing, when the Big Bang happened, was it a big yes? Was it a big no? Or was it a big neutral? Western science tells us that the Big Bang was a big neutral, means it had no cause, it has no direction, and it doesn't mean anything. Western science tells us that evolution, that the creative process, was a cosmic accident that has no meaning, and it's not going anywhere special, and that you and I are all random accidents. So the position of Western science tells us that the creative process is neutral. I have to stop soon? Okay, 5 more minutes? I have a lot to say, that's why I get in trouble. Then, mysticism, most forms of mysticism point us beyond the world. Most forms of mysticism point us beyond the world. And even most of the great religious traditions tell us that when you die, you get to go to heaven. For example, if you're a good Christian, we're told that if we live a moral life, if you live a moral life, then when you die, you're going to get to go to heaven. So what we're told is really where the action is not here on earth, but it is some metaphysical place, some metaphysical heavenly place beyond the world. And if you live a good moral life, you get to experience happiness and spiritual freedom after you die. So the idea here, and also in the Eastern traditions, they kind of have the same position. Because, for example, in Buddhism, if you become a fully enlightened Buddha, they say, if you become fully enlightened in the Buddhist tradition, you never have to come back to earth. You're free from the process of reincarnation. You never have to come back and take a human birth. And that's supposed to be the goal, freedom from reincarnation. So freedom from reincarnation, which is coming back to earth, taking form, is the ultimate goal of the path. The spiritual and philosophical implication is that this is not the place you want to be. But what we discover when we embrace evolutionary spirituality and an evolutionary worldview is that this is really where we want to be, because God as the metaphysical absolute, as timeless, formless being, created this process because he or she or it wanted to have the experience of being in form. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. And how do I know this? Because when you experience the evolutionary impulse, as the sexual impulse, the nature of the sexual impulse is ecstatic, is ecstasy, is a sense of something very positive. When you experience the expression of the evolutionary impulse, is the desire to innovate, when you're in your most creative moments. When any one of us experiences our most creative moments, when any of you have experienced your moments of the most creative moments of your life, you are experiencing something absolutely positive. Were you not? And when you experience the spiritual impulse, which is the urge to become more conscious, you're experiencing something that's absolutely positive. So the nature of the evolutionary impulse, the nature of the desire to exist, is absolute positivity. There's a will towards existence that's overwhelmingly positive. When you discover that that's who you really are, that you really are this authentic self, you really are this evolutionary impulse, and you're not the separate ego or the culturally conditioned self, but you really are the desire to exist in form, you experience enlightenment. You experience evolutionary enlightenment because you discover and you experience a kind of joy and a kind of conviction and a kind of positivity about being here that changes everything. Because you realize that the reason that you're here is to create the world. We are all God as the evolutionary impulse in human form. We are the evolutionary impulse in human form. We're God in human form. And the world is going to be created by us, because there's no God that exists beyond the process. So it's up to each and every one of us to do that. And when you awaken to this evolutionary impulse and creative impulse, its non-metaphysical, its non-relative or absolute nature, you realize the reason that you're here is to create the world and to create the future. That's the reason that you're here. You're not here merely to live a personal life and have personal experiences, but you're here to create the future. And it's a very big reason to be alive. And it's the ultimate reason to exist in the modern and postmodern and post-postmodern world. The ultimate reason to exist is to create the world. And when you and I discover, no doubt whatsoever, that that's who we really are, and that we're here to create the world, we come to the end of ambivalence about being here. We're no longer ambivalent about being in the world. And we suddenly discover we really want to be here. We want to be here completely, without any doubt. Thank you very much.
Перерыв 10 минут. Подробности об эволюционном просветлении на семинаре Эндрю Коэна в Центре «Открытый мир» 28 июня.